The courtroom of the 12th Circuit sat like a hollowed-out monument to old grievances, high ceilings, mahogany panels that had seen a century of lies, and a rhythmic, tired thrum of a ceiling fan that did nothing but stir the scent of stale coffee and floor. Wax. Arthur Sterling sat perfectly still, his hands, calloused from decades of measuring steel beams and calculating concrete pours, rested flat on the table. He didn't look at his legal counsel, Victoria Vance, who sat beside him like a silent sentinel in a charcoal blazer. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked at the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of afternoon sun. "How many properties do you own, Mr. Sterling?" The judge's voice was thin, like parchment paper being torn. The room went unnervingly quiet. The squeak of a chair in the back row sounded like a gunshot. Beside him, he felt the shift in energy. Julian, his stepson, adjusted his tie. Julian was 31, wearing a slim-fit Italian suit that shouted success while his bank account whispered debt. His hair was slicked back with enough product to weather a hurricane, and his smartphone peeked out of his pocket, ready to record a victory he hadn't earned. Next to Julian sat Eleanor. My Eleanor, Arthur thought, though the "my" felt like a phantom limb, something that used to be there but now only throbbed with a dull ache. She clapped her hands together once, a sharp, practiced gesture she used when she felt she was closing a deal. "The house in Oak Ridge, Your Honor," Julian spoke up, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "The family home, that's it. My stepfather has spent 30 years counting nails and living in a Carhartt jacket. If there was more, we'd have seen it. He's a simple man with simple means." Arthur didn't flinch. For 31 years, he had been the background noise in their lives. He was the one who fixed the water heater, the one who paid for Julian's third attempt at a business degree, the one who nodded while Eleanor talked about European cruises they couldn't afford. Silence had been his uniform for so long that they had mistaken it for emptiness. They didn't hear the math running underneath. Arthur's mind was a calculator that never turned off. He was 56 years old. He had spent his life in the industrial guts of the Midwest, estimating warehouses, cold storage units, and strip malls, places people drove past without a second glance. He knew the cost of every bolt and the yield of every acre. "Mr. Sterling," the judge prompted again. Arthur took a breath. 1, 2, 3. He had been counting his whole life. "The Oak Ridge property is the marital home," Victoria Vance said, standing up. Her voice was cool, a sharp contrast to Julian's heat, however. "My client would like to request a short recess to review the affidavits filed this morning by the opposing party." "Granted," the judge said, his gavel tapping the bench with a finality that made Eleanor's head snap toward Arthur. In the hallway, the air was colder. Arthur leaned against the gray cinder block wall, feeling the chill seep through his old work jacket. The same jacket Eleanor used to tease him about. "You look like you're going to a job site even when we're at dinner," she'd say. "Arthur," Victoria stepped up beside him. She was a South Side girl who had fought her way through law school and didn't waste words. They swore under oath this morning. Julian and Eleanor signed an affidavit stating the house is your only asset. They are banking on your simplicity to keep you quiet. Arthur looked at his boots, worn but polished. "They think nothing is a word you use when you don't know how to count, is it?" Victoria asked, her eyes searching his. Arthur almost smiled. "I learned to count long before I learned to speak, Victoria. Let them think they've won the first round. I want to see how high they build their tower before I pull the foundation." Inside the courtroom, Julian was whispering to Eleanor. He looked triumphant. He looked like a man who had already spent the money from a house sale that hadn't happened yet. Arthur sat back down. He felt the weight of the folders in Victoria's briefcase. Decades of LLCs, deeds, and tax returns filed, under names they never bothered to ask about. The Sterling laundromats, the North Side storage, the grain terminal lease. He had played broke for so long that it had become the most expensive habit of his life. But today, the bill was due. The courtroom recess felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. Arthur sat on a hard wooden bench in the corridor, watching the world move in fast forward. People rushed by with briefcases and coffee, but Arthur remained anchored. He was thinking about the winter of 1994. Before Eleanor, there was Sarah. Sarah had been a woman of soft edges and steel resolve. They had met at a rainy construction site where she was delivering blueprints, and he was calculating the load-bearing capacity of a warehouse floor. They didn't have much back then, just a shared love for black coffee, and the dream of building something that lasted. Together, they had started Sterling Industrial. It wasn't a flashy firm. They didn't have an office in a glass skyscraper. They worked out of a garage that smelled like sawdust and old paper. Sarah was the one who taught him the value of the quiet dollar. "Artie," she used to say, her fingers stained with ink from the ledgers, "if you tell the world how much you have, they'll tell you how to spend it. Keep your books clean and your mouth shut." They had spent 15 years buying what others ignored: a bankrupt car wash on the edge of town, a row of dilapidated storage units near the interstate, a small industrial park that everyone said was a tax sinkhole. They didn't buy them to flip them. They bought them to hold them. Then came the cancer. It was fast, aggressive, and indifferent to the life they had built. When Sarah passed, the silence in their home became a vacuum. Arthur found himself sitting in a large house with millions in assets, and no one to share the victory with. For 3 years, he lived like a ghost, working his day job as an estimator for a regional firm, never touching the wealth he and Sarah had accumulated. Then he met Eleanor. She was a whirlwind of color and laughter at a time when Arthur's world was gray. She was a real estate agent with a sharp eye for potential. She saw potential in Arthur, though he realized now she had miscalculated the math. She thought he was a lonely widower with a steady pension and a nice house in Oak Ridge. He didn't lie to her. He just didn't correct her when they married. He kept his industrial holdings in separate LLCs, corporate shells named after the streets where he and Sarah had first worked. Eleanor never asked about the Sterling Wash or Ridge holdings. Mail that came to his P.O. box, she assumed they were just old memberships or professional journals. Then came Julian. Eleanor's son from her first marriage was 10 when Arthur took him in. Arthur had tried to be a father. He had shown up to every baseball game, paid for every broken window, and eventually financed the lifestyle Julian thought he deserved. "You're too old-fashioned, Artie," Julian had said at the dinner table last Thanksgiving, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon Arthur had paid for. "You work for hourly wages while the world is moving to crypto and tech. You're like a dinosaur watching the meteor hit." Eleanor had laughed, patting Arthur's hand condescendingly. "Now, Julian, your stepfather likes his routine. He's comfortable in his little bubble. Not everyone has your vision for the future." Arthur had just passed the mashed potatoes. In his head, he was calculating the quarterly dividends from the grain terminal lease, a check that was currently sitting in a desk drawer, worth more than Julian's entire startup investment. The memory faded as the courtroom doors creaked open. The bailiff signaled for them to return. "Arthur," Victoria Vance whispered as they walked back to their table, "I've gone through the files you brought from the safe. The 1998 transfer for the warehouse interest. The stamp is faded, but the deed is valid. It's the smoking gun. Julian signed a document 2 hours ago swearing that the only thing you own is the clothes on your back and the house you live in." Arthur looked at Julian, who was currently leaning back in his chair, whispering a joke to Eleanor. They were celebrating a victory that hadn't happened. "They think they're playing checkers, Victoria," Arthur said, his voice as steady as a level line. "They don't realize I've already built the board they're standing on." The judge took his seat, his expression unreadable. He looked at the stack of new documents Victoria had placed on the clerk's desk. "We are back on the record," the judge announced. "Ms. Vance, you requested this time to address the assets listed in the respondent's affidavit. Please proceed." Arthur felt the room tighten. Julian's smirk remained, but Eleanor's eyes flickered. She was a real estate agent, after all. She knew the look of a lawyer who was holding a royal flush. "Your Honor," Victoria began, her voice echoing off the mahogany, "my client, Arthur Sterling, has lived a life of extreme discretion, a discretion that his wife and stepson have interpreted as poverty. We would like to introduce Exhibit A, the corporate filings for Sterling Industrial Holdings." The smirk on Julian's face didn't just fade, it evaporated. The air in the courtroom felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. Victoria Vance stood with a stack of blue-bound folders, her movements precise and lethal. She handed the first set to the court clerk, who passed them up to the judge. "Your Honor," Victoria's voice was a cool blade. "The petitioner, Julian, and the respondent's wife, Eleanor, have filed a sworn affidavit claiming the Oak Ridge residence is the sole asset in this estate. They have characterized my client as a man of simple means and limited prospects. We are here to correct the record." Julian leaned forward, his face reddening. "This is a waste of time. He's a construction estimator. He wears boots with mud on them for a living." The judge silenced Julian with a single, sharp look. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, looking at the first folder, "explain Exhibit A." Victoria stepped toward the defense table. Exhibit A is the deed and operating agreement for the Sterling Wash Group. It is a chain of 4 high-volume laundromats across the tri-state area. They were established in 2005, 3 years before the marriage. They are held in a private LLC, of which Arthur Sterling is the 100% owner. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She knew those locations. She had driven past them 1,000 times, thinking they were just eyesores in the industrial district. Those are old buildings," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Old buildings that generate $22,000 in net profit every month," Victoria countered without looking at her. Moving to Exhibit B, Northside Storage, Arthur watched Julian. The young man's cocky posture was collapsing. He looked like a balloon losing air. "Northside Storage," Victoria continued, "consists of 300 climate-controlled units near the I-80 corridor. The land was purchased by Mr. Sterling in 1999. It is currently valued at $4.2 million again. These assets were kept entirely separate from marital funds, as per the meticulous accounting of my client." "Wait a minute," Julian stammered, standing up. "That's impossible. If he had that kind of money, why did he let me take out loans for my business? Why did he drive that beat-up Ford truck?" Arthur spoke for the first time. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of 30 years of patience. "Because, Julian, a truck is a tool, and a loan is a lesson. I offered you a job at the site when you were 20. You told me you didn't want to get your hands dirty. You wanted the big life without the big work. I decided then to let you have exactly what you earned." The judge cleared his throat, looking at Eleanor. "Mrs. Sterling, you are a licensed real estate agent. Are you telling this court that you had no knowledge of your husband's involvement in these commercial holdings?" Eleanor looked at Arthur, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and realization. "He never said a word. He let me pay for the groceries sometimes. He let me think we were struggling." "No," Arthur said softly. "I let you think I was enough. You were the one who equated my value with my bank balance. You stopped looking at me years ago. Eleanor, you started looking at what you could get from me." Victoria wasn't finished. "The final piece, Your Honor, Exhibit C, the Riverside Grain terminal lease. This was the missing piece Arthur had searched for in the old archives." The folder was thick, containing a stamped deed from a snowy afternoon in 1998. "This interest was rolled into a protected trust," Victoria explained. "It pays out an annual dividend of $180,000. It has been doing so for over a decade. The total valuation of the Sterling estate, excluding the marital home, is approximately $12.5 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian sank back into his chair. The expensive suit now looked 3 sizes too big for him. Eleanor was gripping her purse so hard her knuckles were white. She had spent years complaining about Arthur's lack of ambition, years plotting how to take the house and the divorce, so Julian could have a start, never realizing she was sitting on a gold mine she had been too arrogant to see. The judge looked at the affidavit Julian and Eleanor had signed. His expression turned grim. "Mr. Julian, Mrs. Sterling, you both signed a sworn statement under penalty of perjury that no other assets existed. You didn't just underestimate Mr. Sterling. You attempted to defraud this court by claiming he had nothing to offer." "We didn't know," Eleanor cried out. "That is the problem," the judge said, his voice cold. "You lived with this man for over a decade and never bothered to know him. But the law knows him now." Arthur looked out the window. The sun was still shining on the dust motes. He felt a strange sense of lightness. The secret was out, but so was the burden. He had spent his life building foundations for people who didn't. Even though they were standing on his hard work, the tower had been built, and now, the foundation was moving. The legal victory was a cold comfort. As Arthur walked out of the courthouse following the revelation of his assets, he didn't feel like a millionaire. He felt like a man who had been living in a house with mirrors that showed him a stranger's face. To clear his head, he drove his old Ford truck, the Rust Bucket, as Julian called it, to Post 118. It was a veteran's bar on the edge of the industrial district, a place that smelled of fried perch, sawdust, and the weary honesty of men who had worked for every cent they owned. Arthur had been coming here since his first wife, Sarah, passed away. The dim neon lights and the hum of the jukebox were the only things that didn't demand a version of him. He sat at the far end of the scarred mahogany bar, ordering a light beer. He was counting the scratches on the bar top, 1, 2, 3, when he heard a laugh that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was Julian. He was tucked into a high-backed booth in the dark corner of the room, far enough away not to notice Arthur in the shadows, but close enough for his voice to carry. He was with Eleanor and a couple of his investor friends, young men in bright polos, who looked like they had never held a hammer in their lives. "I'm telling you," Julian's voice boomed, dripping with a condescending rot. "The old man is a fossil. He's spent 30 years counting bricks. He thinks a big night is a steak at the diner." And a quiet porch, Eleanor giggled, a sound that hit Arthur harder than a physical blow. "He really is a simple soul," she said, her voice sounding thinner, performative. "He doesn't want anything more. He's happy just existing. It's almost sad, really. Like a dog that's happy with a dry bone." Julian clinked his glass against the table. "To new beginnings. Once we get the Oak Ridge house signed over, I'm finally moving the startup to Chicago. Let Artie stay in his boots. He wouldn't know what to do with a real life if it hit him in the face." One of Julian's friends laughed. "Does he even know what he's sitting on? That house is worth a fortune in this market." "He doesn't know a thing," Julian sneered. "He's too busy counting nails to see the sky falling." Arthur sat perfectly still. His hand tightened around his beer bottle until his knuckles turned as white as the foam. This was the family he had protected. This was the woman he had tried to love after Sarah, and the boy he had treated as a son. In that bar, surrounded by men who toasted to service and sacrifice, Arthur realized his silence hadn't been a shield, it had been a cage. He had let them believe he was nothing because it was easier than fighting for respect. He thought about the millions in the bank. He thought about the warehouse that kept the local economy moving. He thought about the laundromats where single mothers could afford to wash their children's clothes because he kept the prices low. He wasn't a dog with a bone. He was the one who built the kennel. He finished his beer, set the bottle down with a quiet, deliberate click, and paid in cash. He walked past their booth. For a split second, his eyes met Eleanor's. The color drained from her face as she realized he had heard everything. Julian's laugh died mid-throat, replaced by a sudden, jagged silence. Arthur didn't stop. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. He just tipped his cap. The old, worn one Julian hated and walked out into the biting Illinois wind. The next morning, he sat in Victoria Vance's office. The blinds were half closed. The morning traffic a low hum below. "They celebrated my nothingness at a bar last night." "Victoria," Arthur said, his voice like grinding stones. Victoria looked up from her files. "I heard. Eleanor's lawyer called me this morning trying to strike a deal before the judge issues the final ruling on the affidavit." "No deals," Arthur said. "They signed a sworn statement that I own nothing but the house, and they signed it with a smile. It's time they learn that when you miscalculate the man, you lose the math. If we push for perjury and misrepresentation," Victoria warned, "it won't just be a divorce. Julian could face charges. Eleanor's real estate license could be flagged. It will be a total demolition." Arthur looked at his hands, steady, scarred, and capable. "I've spent 30 years estimating demolition costs, Victoria. I know exactly what it takes to tear down a structure that's no longer safe to live in." He stood up and looked out at the city he had helped build, one brick at a time. "Start the count," he said. The atmosphere in the courtroom for the final hearing was different. The air was no longer heavy with mystery. It was sharp with the scent of an impending storm. Arthur Sterling arrived early, wearing a clean charcoal suit, not the flashy, thin fabric Julian favored, but a heavy, tailored wool that felt like armor. Eleanor and Julian sat at their table, looking diminished. The bravado from the bar had vanished. Eleanor's eyes were rimmed with red, and Julian's hands wouldn't stop fidgeting with a gold pen he had likely bought to celebrate a victory that was now a ghost. The judge entered and wasted no time. He looked over his spectacles at the two of them. "In my 20 years on the bench," the judge began, his voice echoing like a tolling bell, "I have rarely seen such a blatant display of bad faith. You filed a sworn affidavit claiming Mr. Sterling was a man of zero assets. Yet, the evidence shows a portfolio that rivals the most successful developers in this county." "Your Honor," Eleanor's lawyer tried to intervene. "My client was truly unaware. Ignorance is not a legal shield when it is rooted in arrogance," the judge snapped. "She is a real estate professional. To claim she lived with this man for years and never noticed the management of a $12 million estate is either a lie or a confession of gross negligence. Either way, the affidavit stands as a fraudulent filing." The judge turned his gaze to Julian. "And you, young man, you signed a statement regarding a man you called father for 20 years, claiming he was a pauper so you could strip him of his home. Because of the misrepresentation in your filings, the motion to claim the Oak Ridge property as a shared marital asset is denied." Julian looked like he had been slapped. Eleanor let out a stifled sob. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am referring this file to the district attorney for a review of perjury charges. Regarding the signed affidavits, Mr. Sterling has requested, and I am granting, an immediate stay of the divorce proceedings until a full audit of the concealed intent of the petitioners is completed. The Oak Ridge house remains the sole property of Arthur Sterling." The gavel hit the bench with a sound like a bone breaking. It was overdone as the room cleared. Eleanor rushed toward Arthur. Her voice was high and panicked. "Arthur, please, we can talk about this. I didn't mean those things I said at the bar. I was frustrated. We're a family." Arthur stopped and looked at her. For the first time, he didn't see the woman he had tried to build a new life with. He saw a bad blueprint, a structure with no soul. "We were never a family, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice as steady as a concrete slab. "A family counts on each other. You and Julian just counted on me to be a floor you could walk on. Well, the floor just gave way. What am I supposed to do?" she cried. "Julian's business is failing. The house is yours. Where are we supposed to go?" "I've spent my life making sure people have a roof over their heads," Arthur replied. "I've donated a warehouse to the city's housing program this morning. If you need a place to stay, I suggest you start filling out the paperwork. It's a good program. They help people who have nothing." He turned away, leaving them standing in the middle of the empty courtroom. Outside, the winter sun was bright and cold. Arthur stood on the courthouse steps and took a deep breath. He called Victoria Vance. "Victoria," he said, "the keys to the Oak Ridge house. I want them changed by 5 o'clock. Everything of theirs is to be packed and put into one of my storage units on the north side. Give them the first month for free. After that, they pay the market rate like everyone else." "And you, Arthur?" Victoria asked. "Where are you going?" Arthur looked at the silver river in the distance. "I'm going to a place I should have visited a long time ago. I'm going to go sit by Sarah's grave and tell her that I finally learned how to speak up." He walked to his truck. He didn't feel the need to count his breaths anymore. He wasn't waiting for the next blow. He was the one moving the earth now. That the first morning in his new condo was different. There were no slammed cabinets, no high-pitched complaints about the lack of ambition, and no heavy tension hiding in the corners of the room. There was only the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the sight of the Illinois River moving steadily outside his window. Arthur Sterling stood on his balcony with a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee. The steam rose into the crisp morning air, vanishing like the old ghosts of his past. He wasn't looking at his bank balance. He wasn't thinking about the millions he had successfully protected. He was counting his breaths. 1, 2, 3. It was the first time in 30 years they didn't feel heavy. A week after the final hearing, the Oak Ridge house sat empty. Arthur had sold it. He didn't want the memories of a marriage that was built on a lie. He had donated a significant portion of the sale to a local vocational school, a place where young men and women learned to use their hands, to measure twice, and cut once, and to build things that lasted. He had received a final letter from Eleanor's lawyer. She was living in a small apartment on the south side, her real estate license under review following the court's report of her fraudulent affidavit. Julian had been forced to take a job as a junior clerk at a shipping firm. He was finally learning what it meant to earn a paycheck by the hour. Arthur didn't feel joy at their struggle. He just felt the cold, hard logic of a finished equation. They had gambled on his silence, and they had lost. That afternoon, Arthur drove out to the north side storage units. He didn't go to check the books or audit the units. He went to see Samuel, the old retired county worker who had helped him find the missing warehouse deed. "Still counting, Arthur?" Samuel asked, leaning against the gate. "Just the blessings now, Sam." Arthur replied with a faint smile. He handed Samuel an envelope. It wasn't a bribe. It was a thank you, a generous check to help the old man's grandson through trade school. Arthur knew that the world didn't need more visionaries in slim-fit suits like Julian. It needed more people who knew how to keep a building standing. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, Arthur made one last stop. He drove to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. He sat on the small stone bench he had installed years ago. "I did it, Sarah," he whispered. "I stopped being a ghost." He realized then that his silence had been a tribute to her for too long. He had used it to hide from a world that didn't understand the quiet strength of a builder. But now, he had spoken. He had reclaimed his name, Arthur Sterling, and he had done it with the dignity she always admired. Sometimes people ask Arthur why he never told his family what he had. He tells them the truth. He spent his life counting materials so buildings wouldn't fall. But he forgot to count respect. And if you don't count it for yourself, others will get the math wrong every time. Revenge wasn't the courtroom victory. It wasn't watching Julian's face go pale or Eleanor's tears. That was just arithmetic, necessary, final. The real victory was the calm. The real victory was the space to breathe. Arthur Sterling finished his coffee, stood up, and walked toward his truck. He didn't look back. He had a new blueprint now, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't building it for anyone else. He was building it for himself. The luxury condo overlooking the Illinois River was a world away from the dust-choked streets of the South Side where Arthur Sterling had begun. To understand the man who could sit in a courtroom with a pulse that never skipped a beat, one had to look at the winter of 1985. It was a year of bone-chilling winds and a hunger that bit deeper than the cold. Arthur was 24 then, a lanky young man with a calculator in his pocket and a permanent smudge of graphite on his thumb. He worked as a junior estimator for a firm that treated men like gears in a machine. His father, a man who had broken his back installing HVAC units in the humid summers of Peoria, had given him one piece of advice before he passed. "Artie, people will try to measure you by the clothes you wear. Let them. You just make sure you're the one holding the tape measure." It was on a rain-slick construction site for a mid-sized warehouse that he met Sarah. She wasn't a socialite or a dreamer. She was a blueprint runner for the lead architect. She wore a yellow slicker and boots caked in mud, carrying rolls of paper like they were sacred scrolls. "The load-bearing calculations for the north wall are off," she had said, not even looking at him, her eyes fixed on the drawings. Arthur had blinked, surprised. "I calculated those myself." "Then you calculated them for a sunny day, not for an Illinois winter," she countered, finally looking up. In her eyes, Arthur saw a reflection of his own solo person who cared about the truth of a structure more than the ego of the builder. They were married 6 months later in a courthouse that smelled of old tobacco, followed by a dinner of burgers and fries. They didn't have a honeymoon. Instead, they took the $300 they had saved and opened a high-interest savings account. We're going to build an empire, Artie. Sarah had whispered that night in their cramped, one-bedroom apartment. But we're going to build it underground, like a root system, so when the storm comes, nothing can pull us up. The years that followed were a blur of grueling labor. Arthur worked his 12-hour shifts at the firm, then came home to work another 6 hours on their private ventures. They bought their first property in 1989, a dilapidated laundromat on 4th Street. The windows were smashed, and the machines were rusted husks. "Why this, Sarah?" Arthur had asked, wiping grease from his forehead. "Because, Artie," she said, already scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees, "no matter how poor a man is, he still needs clean clothes for a job interview. This isn't a laundromat. It's a gold mine in disguise." They lived on a budget that would have made a monk weep. Arthur wore the same Carhartt jacket for a decade, patching the elbows himself. Sarah cut her own hair and worked double shifts as a night nurse. They saw each other at 5 a.m. every day, a brief crossover where they shared a single pot of coffee and discussed the only thing that mattered, the numbers. "Sterling Wash LLC is in the black," Arthur said one morning, showing her the ledger. Sarah smiled, a tired, beautiful smile. "Now we buy the storage units on the interstate. No more vacations we don't take, Artie, just more bricks." But the bricks couldn't protect them from everything. In the late 90s, Sarah was diagnosed with a rare form of lymphoma. The empire they had built, the secret LLCs, the laundromats, the growing interest in industrial warehouses, suddenly felt like a pile of cold ash. Arthur spent every penny of their liquid cash on the best doctors, but Sarah was a builder who knew when a structure was failing. In her final days, she took Arthur's hand. Her grip was weak, but her voice was clear. "Don't let them see it, Artie. The money, the properties, they're your armor. Stay quiet, stay deep. Only speak when the foundation is threatened." When Sarah passed, the silence in Arthur's life became a permanent resident. He locked the deeds in a heavy floor safe and went back to work as a simple estimator. He lived in the same modest house, drove the same truck, and wore the same boots. He wasn't hiding his wealth out of greed. He was guarding the only thing he had left of the woman who had built his life with him. Then came Eleanor. She was a whirlwind of perfume and bright smiles, a real estate agent who saw a safe man in Arthur. To her, he was a steady pension and a quiet life. She never saw the shadow of Sarah in the room. She never saw the man who had laid 10,000 bricks with his own hands. She saw a man she could mold, a man who was simple, and for 10 years, Arthur let her believe it. He watched as she brought her son, Julian, into his home. He watched as Julian grew into a man who valued the label on a suit more than the quality of the stitch. He listened as they whispered about his small-mindedness over dinners he paid for. He stayed silent because Sarah had told him to. He stayed silent because he was waiting for the moment the storm would come. As Arthur stood on his balcony in the present, he looked at his hands, the same hands that had scrubbed the floors of that first laundromat. He realized that part 7 of his life was over. The foundation was no longer underground. It was time for the world to see exactly what kind of tower Arthur Sterling had built in the dark. Arthur Sterling's silence had been misinterpreted by Eleanor and Julian as weakness, but in reality, it was a lesson they were never humble enough to learn. 10 years had passed since the wedding, and Arthur watched as Eleanor drifted further away from the woman he thought she was. The same woman who once praised his simplicity had turned it into a weapon of mockery. "Arthur, your old boots are tracking mud into the foyer again," Eleanor snapped one evening. She was draped in an expensive silk gown, purchased with the very money Arthur provided. "Don't you ever feel embarrassed? My friends' husbands from the real estate firm are talking about trips to the Amalfi Coast. And you're just lost in your dusty blueprints and the price of gravel." Arthur said nothing. He simply picked up his boots and placed them neatly in the corner. In his mind, he was calculating the quarterly revenue of Sterling Industrial's newest warehouse. A single month's profit exceeded Eleanor's entire yearly shopping budget. But he didn't speak. He wanted to see how far this relationship would go without the performance of wealth. Then there was Julian, Eleanor's son, whom Arthur had raised as his own. Julian was 30 now, yet his mindset remained that of a spoiled child. One night, The atmosphere at the dining table was suffocating. Julian gripped an expensive smartphone, ranting about a new tech startup. "We need seed funding." "Mom," Julian said, gesturing toward Arthur as if he were a ghost. "But what can we expect from Artie? He's spent his entire life driving the same rusted truck. He has no idea how money is made in the modern world. His mind is limited to bricks and mortar." Eleanor laughed, siding with her son. "You're right. Honey, Arthur only knows how to get by. He doesn't have that spark that successful men have." Arthur lowered his spoon. He looked at Julian, the boy whose every tuition bill, legal fine, and luxury watch had been quietly paid for by Arthur's hand. Arthur wanted to tell him, "The bricks you're mocking are the only reason there is a roof over your head." But still, he remained silent. The real explosion happened when Arthur found papers Eleanor had accidentally left on the library table. They weren't divorce papers, they were legal documents to sell the house. Eleanor and Julian had plotted to have Arthur declared mentally incapacitated or use a legal loophole to evict him, so Julian could fund his failing business. "He's a pathetic old man." Julian's voice drifted from the kitchen. "We'll move him into some cheap apartment. He can spend his days counting his old files there. He won't even realize what hit him." Arthur put the papers back exactly as he found them. His hands weren't shaking. They were cold and steady. He realized that by staying silent, he had allowed them to become so arrogant that they had lost their humanity. That night, after they slept, Arthur went to the basement safe. Behind Sarah's photo were the deeds and documents that proved Arthur Sterling was the biggest silent player in the state. He messaged Victoria Vance, "The structure is compromised beyond repair. Demolition begins tomorrow." The next morning, outside the courtroom, Eleanor stopped him. "Arthur, just sign the papers. This is going to be hard for you. We just want to lighten your burden." Arthur looked into her eyes. There was no love left, only greed. "Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice deep and resonating for the first time, "you mistook my silence for weakness. Today, you'll learn that when an expert tears down a building, he doesn't make a sound. He just shifts the foundation." Julian laughed from behind, buttoning his slim-fit suit. "Sure, Artie. Let's see where your patience gets yow." When the courtroom doors swung shut, Eleanor and Julian wore smirks of triumph, as if they had already won the war. The judge opened the file and looked sternly at Arthur, but Arthur's eyes no longer held that old exhaustion. Instead, they held a sharp clarity, the kind found only in those who know the tide is about to turn. Victoria Vance stood up. She held an old, leather-bound folder in her hand. "Your Honor," she began, "before you pass judgment, I wish to place facts before this court that the petitioner has conveniently hidden in their affidavit." Julian shifted in his chair and scoffed. "What facts?" "That Artie has nothing to his name but some old bags of cement." The judge silenced Julian with a sharp gesture. Victoria pulled out the first document. "Exhibit A, Sterling Industrial Holdings. This is no small operation. Under this entity sit 3 major warehouses and 2 shopping strips. Their total valuation is approximately $8 million, and all of this was built by Arthur Sterling, alongside his late first wife, Sarah." A vacuum of silence hit the room, as if everyone had collectively held their breath. Eleanor's face turned ghostly white. "That's a lie," she stammered. "I've seen his tax returns. He's just a simple estimator." Victoria pulled out a second sheet. "Tax returns only show a salary, Mrs. Sterling. But these LLCs are separate legal entities. And here is Exhibit B, Julian. The building you plan to lease for your startup. The actual owner is none other than Arthur Sterling himself. You were planning to pay rent to your own stepfather, completely unaware that he held the deed." The expensive pen slipped from Julian's hand, clattering to the floor. His pride was turning to ash. The man he had mocked as a fossil and a loser turned out to be the master of his entire world. The judge studied the papers intently before looking at Eleanor and Julian. "You both swore under oath that there were no assets beyond the family home. This is not a misunderstanding. This is an attempt to defraud this court." Mr. Sterling remained silent to protect his late wife's legacy. "But you took malicious advantage of that silence." The verdict was swift. Divorce granted. However, Eleanor did not receive a single inch of the Sterling estate. Julian's business filings were canceled on the grounds of fraud. To top it off, the judge imposed heavy fines on both of them. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was bright and cold. Eleanor came running toward Arthur. "Arthur, I made a mistake. We can start over. I'll stay with you. I don't care about the money anymore." Arthur adjusted his old hat and looked directly into Eleanor's eyes. "Eleanor, you once called me a dog with a dry bone. Today, you don't even have the bone. Money was just a number, but what you did to my dignity and Sarah's memory, that is a debt no bank can settle." Julian stood nearby in his cheap suit, looking truly pathetic. Arthur glanced at him and said, "Julian, always remember, bricks don't just build houses, they build character. You learned how to show off, but you never learned how to build a foundation." Arthur walked toward his old truck. He started the engine, turned on the radio, and drove away. 1 month later, Arthur sold the Oak Ridge house that Eleanor had been eyeing so greedily. He donated every cent of the proceeds to a charity trust in Sarah's name, one that taught vocational skills to underprivileged children. He moved into a new, peaceful condo overlooking the river. Standing there with his old coffee mug in hand, he picked up his phone and messaged Victoria. "The count is finally 0. I am starting fresh." There was no more noise in Arthur Sterling's life, only peace. He still wore his old boots, but now the mud on them was a badge of honor. He had proven that silence is not a weakness, it is the power to shake the world when the time is right. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.